The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Welcome to Real Agriculture's Canola School series. I'm Kara Oosterhuis. I have here with me Keith Gabert of the Canola Council of Canada, and we are here in central Alberta talking about Bertha armyworm. As you can see, Keith here is standing beside an armyworm trap. Keith, what are you telling producers right now?
So Bertha armyworms are actually a climbing cutworm. So we're not telling them anything about Bertha armyworms right now, but this same family of insects likes to chew on canola. So the only news for Bertha armyworms already in 2023 is that we think that their emergence is ahead of schedule. So unlike some of the other cutworms that are bothering us here the end of May or June, Bertha armyworms overwinter as a pupae. Those adults are going to hatch out now, and they're going to be flying around. Now they're looking for a canola field to lay some eggs in. If you have sufficient numbers of Bertha armyworms and enough eggs that survive, and those little larvae grow from really, really tiny worms through to those 2-inch black monsters, if you want to call them that, on your canola in late August, you could have a problem. But the easiest indication, or the first indication we're going to have of Bertha armyworms, is likely this trap network that Alberta Agriculture runs. I run one set of traps on their behalf. They're set up on the edge of the field like this, 2 traps a good distance apart. We've deployed these a little earlier this year. We had a really warm May, so we think that means those moths will be flying earlier, and I don't have any Bertha armyworms after a week of trapping, which is likely good news. This area is typically low for these particular moths. We had a few fields that would have had outbreaks even in this area last year, so the suspicion is that we're on a bit of an upturn for Bertha armyworms as a native pest of canola, or at least native to here and happy to eat canola. We know that they can be a problem, and they tend to cycle over a number of years through highs and lows, and we haven't had much of an issue with Berthas in this area for quite some time. So looking, or at least considering the fact that there might be an upturn, these traps are actually really good in that the indication that you'll get is just based on the numbers. If you have less than 300 adult moths over the course of the trapping season, which is about 8 weeks, you're unlikely to have issues. If you have 300 to 900 moths, we'd like you to scout and sort of keep track. If you have more than that, we're pretty certain you're going to have a Bertha armyworm issue. So really great early warning system for Bertha armyworms, and something you can go online and look at the cumulative trap totals for an indication if this will be one more concern with canola in 2023.
And now we're standing on the edge of a field. Is that typically where you set up traps?
Well, we don't want your high clearance sprayer to hit these. So really it could be in the field, but really we want it next to a field of canola, preferably between a field of last year's canola and a field of this year's canola, away from some strong light sources, because these moths are night flying moths, so a really strong light might distract them. But there's also a bait, a bit of a pheromone lure hung above this trap that really attracts in the males. So we're only counting the males, but that's a pretty good indication of what the population might do. So if we catch a lot of Berthas, we start to get worried.
So how can you tell the difference if you're trapping? You said you're only counting the males. Do the females not come into the trap?
As far as I know, the females don't even come in here, because the pheromone is a female attractant pheromone. So the males are the only ones crazy enough to chase it down, at which point they fall into the tunnel. We also get bycatch insects we don't expect, big bumblebees, flies, other moths. So there's some good pictures online where they give us instructions how to count these. In the piece, for example, we only deploy 1 trap per location. There's a species of bumblebees that really is attracted to these and looking for a home, not necessarily for the attractant, but they find a nice dry hole and they come in here, and the insecticide lure, or the insecticide preservative killer in the trap then disposes of the bumblebees and kills them. So that's not a great problem to have, and because it's pretty common in the piece to have these bumblebees as bycatch, we narrow it down to 1 trap in those locations.
So what kind of damage can the Bertha armyworm actually do?
So Bertha armyworms are a climbing cutworm. They're relatively large mouthparts when they're older. When they're smaller, they've got masses of eggs that are laid on the leaves. Those tiny worms can mine in the leaf. You're unlikely to see much damage. It really takes several weeks of growth through several instars as these moths grow. So when they get to be teenagers, medium size, they start to chew a lot of leaf material. Once they're done with your leaf material, they climb up the plant and start to chew on your pods. So it's really typical, maybe not every year, but almost every year, that some farmer somewhere will phone me and say, these weren't here last week and now they're climbing and waving at me from the road. So when they're mature, they're large enough you can see them at 30 miles an hour, maybe even 60 miles an hour, traveling down the road. And they will literally eat through the walls of the pods and chew seeds, but they don't do that until they've eaten the easy feeding, that's the leaves. So the leaves are a fantastic indicator of problems in your crop. So if you have nice, fully developed, unchewed upon leaves in your canola, you're unlikely to have a chewing insect problem. If you see a few holes in those leaves, that's not likely to be a problem, but it's an indication something's eating it. So you need to figure out what that is. And if it's small Bertha armyworms that will become big Bertha armyworms, and if you have more than about 20 per meter squared, they can take away a significant part of your crop.
And what does that feeding actually look like on the leaf? Because how do you decipher, what's a flea beetle, what's a Bertha armyworm, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so the feeding activity from any insect is usually based upon what its mouth parts look like. So if you've got a lygus bug, it has a piercing, sucking mouth part, you'll find a hole with maybe some leaking happening. If it's a diamondback moth, which is a pretty small worm, maybe half an inch max for length, you're going to see that it has small mouth parts, and it might eat the green part of the leaf but leave the waxy parts. So you might have some what we call window painting. You have holes in the leaves that don't actually go all the way through. They left the hard to digest wax behind. When you're a bigger cutworm like a Bertha armyworm, you just eat everything your mouth can wrap itself around. So you have physical holes or half the leaf missing. Grasshopper damage is a little hard to distinguish, but usually they're hopping around your feet when you're trying to diagnose the problem as well. So it's simply a matter of looking around the field and seeing what's there.
So control options, you can spray for Bertha armyworm?
Absolutely. There's a number of different products on the market. The pyrethroids are great. The group 28 has some residual activity. Lots of good activities with different pre-harvest intervals. The key with Bertha armyworms is because they do develop over a long period of time, is that you should get in there and look for them and spray them early so that you don't have that kind of damage that we were discussing. You want to keep your leaves and have them actively filling those pods for you. So those leaves will drop off naturally. So even if the berthas don't eat all your leaves, there's a chance all those leaves are going to become roughly inedible, and they're going to move up onto the pods anyway. And I've yet to meet a grower that has any tolerance for Bertha armyworms eating pods.
Thresholds, what's out there? So
there's a great threshold chart where it lists the cost of the application and the number of Bertha armyworms per meter squared. So you can look at that chart and determine where you're at. If we're blessed with high prices for canola like we were in 2022, that threshold is relatively low. In my mind, I use 20 per meter squared as kind of the you will have to do something at that mark. But at high canola prices, it's going to be a little lower. The key for that threshold, though, is that you need to go into the field and pretend like you're a really big bird. So you come into the field, you shake out a bunch of canola, a meter squared, you let all those insects, worms drop onto the ground. I would then pick up the dried leaves, anything on the base of the ground, just pick them up in the first few seconds. And then sit back for a minute or two and watch, because these insects are relatively smart. They know something just tried to get them, and they don't move. And they're really hard. They're camouflaged against the soil, in the trash, in the stubble. So if you give them a minute or two, you'll see them start to relax and start to uncurl from that tight sort of C shape they were in. And then you'll count them. And often, if you don't do that, you miss half of them. So make sure you wait, get an accurate count, do it in at least 3 different spots in the field. There are occasions where this is just a patchy problem, but for the most part, when we have a Bertha armyworm issue, you have them, your neighbors have them, these moths have flown around the neighborhood. They can be a little bit choosy about which field they choose, so there may be a difference based upon variety, time of flowering, stage when they went by. But for the most part, when you have a Bertha armyworm issue, your whole county has a Bertha armyworm issue.